This is Australia, and it has a massive problem. To understand it, let's imagine a scenario. All fuel imports suddenly collapse. Most countries have about 90 days to find a solution. Australia has less than 3 weeks. If no new fuel supply is secured, transport starts breaking down and store shelves begin to empty. And honestly, that's absurd. Australia is an energy giant that produces its own oil. You'd think it could simply refine that oil into fuel for domestic use, but 96% of its crude is exported. As for the fuel the country actually runs on, about 90% of it's imported from abroad on those same ocean tanker routes. So how did a wealthy, advanced nation with millions of barrels of oil end up this dependent on foreign fuel deliveries? Let's find out. So let's jump to Australia in the mid-20th century, the early 1950s. Back then, the country was importing all of its fuel, just like before. But even at that stage, Australia had already come to a clear conclusion: real fuel independence meant producing fuel at home. And from there, the country began to change dramatically. In just a few years, from 1951 to 1960, Australia's industrial landscape was transformed beyond recognition. A couple of tiny, outdated facilities were replaced by modern, world-class refineries. In 1954, Shell's refinery in Geelong became the first major piece of that puzzle. And for the first time, the country could produce its own high-octane aviation fuel and gasoline for the new Holden cars that were just starting to dominate the Australian roads. Soon after, the focus moved to Western Australia, where the Kwinana refinery came online in 1955. At the time, it was the largest industrial project in the nation's history. On the East Coast, the system was strengthened by the Kurnell refinery near Sydney, completed by 1956. This was all part of a deliberate push. Shell, BP, Mobil, and Caltex invested a combined total of more than $100 million to turn the continent from a simple fuel importer into a fully fledged refining nation. And the numbers speak louder than any slogan. At first, local refining capacity covered only about 15% of demand. By the end of the decade, it was meeting roughly 80%, with Australian refineries processing around 400,000 to 600,000 barrels of oil per day. That foundation later helped fuel the country's obsession with cars, highways, suburban expansion, and car culture in general. The refining system remained stable for a couple of decades, but then Asia began developing something Australian refiners had never even imagined. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, hardly anyone was seriously talking about an oil hub of the East yet, but the signs were already there. Singapore was the first to pull ahead. The irony was that it had no oil of its own. None at all. What it did have was something else: strategic thinking and a focus on refining. One of its islands began turning into the massive Jurong hub, where crude oil arrived from all over the world and then left again as finished products. After that, the process snowballed. South Korea and Japan moved fast without much hesitation. They were building industrial complexes on such a huge scale that people in the West watched with envy, or at least they say so. Take Ulsan in South Korea. It wasn't just a refinery, it was an entire industrial city, where oil wasn't simply refined, but broken down into everything imaginable: fuel, chemicals, plastics, and it all ran almost non-stop, 24 hours a day. That was when the contrast became impossible to ignore. A typical Australian refinery of that era processed about 50,000 to 100,000 barrels a day, a decent level by the standards of the time, but across Asia, new facilities were coming online that would eventually operate at 500,000 to 800,000 barrels a day. But it wasn't just about the numbers, although they are impressive. It's hard to argue with it. Something else was happening at the same time. While Australia's equipment was gradually aging, Asian plants were using the newest technology available at the time. The machinery was faster, more precise, and more efficient. There were fewer losses and higher yields. The whole process simply looked more streamlined. Refining oil in Asia was much cheaper, and there was really no arguing with that. As a result, something happened that would have sounded odd just a few years earlier. For Australia, it became more profitable to ship its oil across the ocean to those new Asian refineries than to keep trying to squeeze maximum output from its own worn-out facilities. By that point, the future of Australian refining was already looking very uncertain. But that still wasn't the end of the problem. Australia's oil simply wasn't the right fit for Australia's own needs. If we go back to the early 1950s, when Australia didn't yet have its own refineries, there was one important detail. The country didn't have large domestic oil reserves, so it relied heavily on crude imports from the Middle East, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. It also bought oil from closer neighbors, Indonesia and North Borneo. But where was the problem? All of Australia's refineries were built specifically to process that imported crude. And then, once oil was finally discovered in Australia, it turned out to be completely different from what those plants had been designed for. The oil coming from the Middle East and Indonesia was heavy and dense. It was more like thick, dark syrup with a high sulfur content, so the refineries in Australia, built in that era, were engineered as massive, highly rigid systems for exactly that kind of feedstock. Every furnace, every pipeline, every pressure gauge was calibrated to handle that thick, sulfur-rich crude. The equipment was dependable, but extremely specialized. Built around what was essentially the global standard at the time, Australia crude, by contrast, turned out to be light. It was more fluid, almost clear, and contained very little sulfur. In terms of quality, it was actually far superior to the imported oil and looked more like diesel than heavy fuel oil. That should have been a huge advantage. But for Australia's refining industry, it became a serious technical problem because processing it properly would have required major reconfiguration of existing plants. So instead, Australia chose to send its own crude to those same Asian refineries, even at a high cost. And there was another important factor here. It wasn't just that Australia's refineries weren't suited to domestic crude or that Asia had more advanced processing capacity. Geography was also a huge factor. Australia's main oil resources were scattered across different corners of an enormous continent, often extremely far from the country's largest population centers. The first major reserves were found in eastern Queensland and in the remote Cooper Basin in central Australia. More oil was discovered offshore as well, especially in the Gippsland Basin in Bass Strait, in the southeast between Victoria and Tasmania. The fields in the northwest near Dampier and Karratha became especially important. Now imagine what it takes to move crude from there to Sydney, Melbourne, or Brisbane. We're talking about thousands of miles, deserts, open water, and areas with very limited infrastructure. At that point, geography itself was practically pointing toward the answer. Singapore was actually closer than much of Australia's own interior. It sounds a bit insane, but in practice, that was often true. From the northwestern fields, shipping crude to ports in Southeast Asia could be easier and cheaper than moving it across Australia to the East Coast. And in big business, distance is almost another word for cost. The farther you move something, the more you pay. Simple as that. So, Australia ends up selling its own oil, importing other countries' crude, and turning that into fuel. How did the country get to the point where it began importing 90% of its fuel? It turned out that shipping crude oil, refining it domestically, and maintaining huge refineries was simply more expensive than buying finished fuel in Asia. So refinery owners didn't hesitate. Why keep a complicated operation running when you can reduce the whole system to something much simpler, receive a tanker, and distribute the fuel? Lower costs, lower risks, less hassle. It may have been a cold decision, but it was a logical one. And that's when the ugly process really began. It started back in 2003 when the Port Stanvac refinery shut down. At the time, it looked like a one-off case and hardly anyone paid much attention, but a few years later, it became clear that this was only the beginning. In 2012, Clyde was closed. 2 years later, Cornell followed. Then in 2015, Bulwer Island stopped operating as well. One refinery after another disappeared. And each time, the explanation sounded almost exactly the same. Too expensive to maintain, too difficult to modernize. The final blow came much more recently, in 2021. That's when Kwinana and Altona shut down, effectively the last major oil refining sites in the country. After that, any talk of reviving the sector began to sound more like theory than a serious plan. The result was pretty brutal. In the 2000s, Australia had 8 refineries in operation. Now only 2 remain: Lytton in Queensland and Geelong in Victoria. Those 2 are the only facilities still supporting Australia's fuel self-sufficiency, supplying roughly 10% of national demand. Everything else arrives by tanker from overseas. So yes, importing fuel is profitable for Australia, but is it actually safe? To put it plainly, the supply routes can be extremely risky. Here's why. Today, Australia relies heavily on 4 suppliers: South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, and Japan. That's where crude oil is refined and then shipped out to Australian ports as finished fuel. It sounds simple, but those shipments don't always travel through calm, predictable waters. Let's start with the northern route. Supplies coming from Japan and South Korea. Everything there runs through the South China Sea, and that's arguably one of the most tense maritime regions on the planet. Territorial disputes, naval patrols, military ships, shows of force, all of that's happening there, constantly in the background, creating permanent risk. The fuel may fail to reach Australia at all, or it may have to take a longer and more expensive route. Now let's look at the southwestern route, Singapore and Malaysia. These are among Australia's most important fuel suppliers and at the same time among the riskiest. The main corridor here passes through the Strait of Malacca and the waters of the Indonesian archipelago. The Strait of Malacca is narrow, congested, and critically important to global trade. It's often described as a bottleneck of the global ocean economy. Hundreds of vessels move through it at the same time, with traffic packed as tightly as rush hour highway lanes. On top of that, the area has a long history of piracy. But the even more vulnerable section is the Indonesian Straits. For Australia, this is a vital corridor, essentially the only short route to the country's western and northern ports. And that means any major disruption there, whether it's an accident, a closure, or a political conflict, can throw the entire logistics chain into chaos almost instantly. Tankers would be forced to sail all the way around Indonesia, adding thousands of extra miles. And that brings us to fuel reserves. Those are supposed to exist so a country doesn't grind to a halt without fuel. But this is exactly where Australia faces some very real problems. In developed countries, energy security is a very serious matter. The International Energy Agency has a benchmark. Countries are supposed to keep oil and fuel reserves equal to at least 90 days of net imports. Japan, Germany, and South Korea take that standard seriously. They built massive storage systems so their economies could keep running for months, even if they were suddenly cut off. The United States is even more prepared. Its Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the largest in the world, serves as a powerful buffer both for emergencies and for stabilizing the market. Compared to that, Australia doesn't look particularly prepared. Formerly, Australia is also a member of the International Energy Agency, but for years it's fallen short of that 90-day benchmark. In reality, the amount of fuel physically available inside the country is enough for only 20 to 30 days. What does that mean in practice? If maritime supply chains were disrupted by storms, conflict, or blocked routes in Southeast Asia, the situation could turn serious very quickly. Diesel, which underpins transport and resource extraction, would begin running low almost immediately. Within a couple of weeks, shortages could begin. Soon after that, food deliveries, essential services, and everyday logistics would also come under pressure. So, shouldn't the Australian government be trying to make the country more resilient in a crisis? Well, it's trying, although sometimes in rather unusual ways. One of the strangest moves came in 2020, when Australia struck a deal with the United States. At the height of the pandemic, when oil prices had fallen to near record lows, Australia bought about $94 million worth of crude and stored it inside the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve in salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana. On paper, it looked like a smart move. The country had formally increased its reserves, but there was one obvious problem. In a real emergency, that reserve would be sitting about 7,500 miles away. Getting it back to Australia would take weeks, if not longer. The same goes for the agreements with other countries. Under these agreements, Australia gets the right to buy fuel sorted in other countries during an emergency. It sounds like an insurance policy, but in an actual crisis, the obvious question is whether that fuel would be able to reach Australia at all. The gravity of the problem only became clear recently as the situation in the Pacific grew less predictable. In 2021, the government launched a support program for Australia's last remaining refineries. It effectively paid them for every gallon of fuel if market conditions turned against them. In other words, privately owned refineries were treated as strategic assets and kept afloat at almost any cost. At the same time, the government introduced strict minimum stockholding rules. Now the burden falls on companies. They're required to maintain set volumes of gasoline, jet fuel, and especially diesel. To make that possible, the state's been offering grants to build new storage tanks. The result is a distributed storage network across the country. It's not perfect, but it's far more practical than relying on oil or fuel stored somewhere overseas. And if the government really has started taking this more seriously, what does that mean for the future of Australia's refining industry? Let's begin with the most obvious and least pleasant reality. There's a very real risk that Australia's remaining refineries could eventually just give out. The last two plants in Geelong and Lytton are basically industry veterans. They were launched back in the middle of the last century. 6 or 7 decades of operation sounds impressive, but behind that's wear and tear, metal fatigue, and constant repairs. every year they become more expensive to keep running and more dangerous from the standpoint of the country's fuel security. In mid-April 2026, a major fire broke out at the Geelong refinery when its gasoline production unit caught fire. The result was telling. Gasoline output dropped to about 60% of normal, while diesel and jet fuel fell to around 80%. In other words, a single incident showed just how fragile the system really is. A disruption at one facility can hit fuel supplies across several states at once. But even without accidents, the problems are piling up. By 2025 to 2026, refineries were required to switch to ultra-low sulfur gasoline. For plants built in the 1950s and 1960s, that's almost impossible without major reconstruction. They'd have to retrofit modern treatment systems into outdated infrastructure, and no one's eager to do that. So what happens if Australia ends up with no domestic refineries at all and becomes 100% dependent on imports? It's easy to assume that would leave the country in a very weak position, but there's at least some kind of backup plan. In the early 2020s, people started floating the idea of building a new refinery after all. That's when Resilient Energy Australia stepped in with a pretty straightforward message. We're building one. The proposed site is in Queensland in the industrial zone of Gladstone. What makes the idea interesting is that the goal isn't to compete with giant Asian mega refineries. The plan's to build a compact, modern plant that can simply cover the region's key needs without any unnecessary drama. Right now, the project's still in the design and approval stage. A site at the Port of Gladstone has been selected, environmental reviews have been carried out, and the paperwork's moving through government agencies. The approach is already very different from the old model: modular systems, automation, and maximum efficiency at a relatively modest scale. The plan is for the refinery to process about 210,000 barrels per day. By global standards, that isn't huge. But for Australia's east coast, it'd still be a meaningful addition. And the facility's meant to be versatile, producing gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. The main customers would be transport operators, farmers, and airports across Queensland. Now let's look at the map. Right here, almost in the middle of Australia, instead of roads, you've got dusty tracks. And the nearest major city is hundreds of miles away. Almost nobody lives here. And yet, there's a refinery sitting in the middle of it all. It feels a little strange. The thing is, this plant processes local crude right on the spot and produces diesel there as well. By national standards, the volume is tiny, just hundreds of barrels a day, but it has one major advantage. It doesn't depend on ports, tankers, or long supply chains. The fuel's produced close to the oil fields and close to the machinery that actually burns it. And when outside supplies start becoming unreliable, that kind of local production stops looking like a weakness and starts looking like insurance. The refinery is now expected to be expanded, which shows that Australia is still thinking about domestic refining, whether it wants to admit it or not. All of this does sound somewhat encouraging, but will it really provide enough fuel for Australia? Probably not. The scale's just too small, and logically, you'd expect that to be disappointing because the country still doesn't seem ready to fully eliminate the risk of running short of fuel in a critical moment. But this is where things start to get interesting. Australia doesn't seem to be trying to go back to the past. It's moving in a different direction. Yes, the country is still building plants, but not the kind people are used to. Not classic oil refineries, but something fundamentally different. Facilities that make fuel out of waste. Let's take a look at how that actually works. They take ordinary waste, used cooking oil, fats, food scraps, agricultural feedstock, and sometimes even trash with organic matter in it, basically anything that still contains carbon. Then, instead of simply burning it, they process it in specialized facilities. Put simply, the molecules in that material are broken apart and reassembled under high pressure and heat, sometimes with hydrogen added. The result is a liquid fuel that behaves almost like regular diesel or jet fuel. That's the path Australia decided to go down, and it's committing to it in a big way. For example, in Queensland, they're already discussing projects that would use vegetable oils, animal fats, and industrial waste as feedstock. One of those facilities, a relatively small one, is expected to produce about 5.3 million gallons of diesel per year. That's not a huge number, but it's more of a first step, a way to test the technology under real conditions. The next stage is on a completely different scale. In the same region, officials are considering a full-scale complex capable of producing up to about 198 million gallons of fuel a year, including aviation fuel. That's no longer an experiment. It's an attempt to build a real alternative to conventional fuel supplies. What makes it especially important is that the fuel produced is nearly identical to the conventional kind, so it can be used in planes and heavy equipment without redesigning the existing infrastructure. But the most revealing part is that some projects go even further. There are initiatives aimed at turning not just biological feedstock, but ordinary household waste into fuel. One such project involves processing up to about 450,000 gallons of waste per year and producing as much as 264 million gallons of fuel annually. In other words, it's an attempt to weave energy production directly into the waste stream: trash, processing, fuel. Will this save the country from fuel shortages in a crisis? Maybe eventually, sometime in the future, but so far there are no new refineries and no new biofuel plants in operation. All of this is either under construction or still on paper. For now, Australia's only real option is to keep moving toward electrification. The logic is pretty simple. Fewer gasoline and diesel cars means less dependence on tankers bringing fuel in from Asia. Every kilowatt-hour generated at home from solar, wind, or gas means one less share of imported oil. One of the main tools here is the so-called New Vehicle Efficiency Standard, which started rolling out in 2025. The idea is simple: stricter fuel efficiency limits for new cars. Car makers are being pushed to bring in more efficient models because less efficient ones simply won't make the cut. The government hopes this will have a double benefit. If the country spends less on fuel, it also won't need to maintain such massive reserves. According to estimates, replacing just 1 million conventional cars with electric vehicles would cut fuel imports by more than 264 million gallons a year. At the state level, the shift looks even more tangible. In New South Wales, for example, diesel buses are being actively replaced with electric ones, thousands of vehicles in Sydney and beyond. These buses don't just remove diesel from the equation, many of them are also charged using renewable energy. That creates something close to a self-sustaining domestic cycle. At the same time, charging stations are being built along major highways because with Australia's distances, the whole idea would hit a wall pretty quickly without that infrastructure. Still, none of this is a magic fix, and even taken together, these measures don't look like a solution for the here and now. For the moment, Australians can only wait for the country's fuel situation to change in a truly fundamental way, or for the government to start building a lot more refineries and storage facilities. And honestly, that no longer sounds far-fetched. The world is restless enough that even Australia could be forced to make moves like this.